Well, as we approach the 4th of July, we're joined by renowned historian and author Gerald Horne, whose work tears through the patriotic fog to reveal the brutal truths behind America's founding. Horne reminds that the Constitution was not a document of universal freedom, but a fortress for slavery, crafted by enslavers who ruled the early republic. Professor Horne, as we approach another 4th of July, your work reminds us that the founding of the United States was deeply, deeply rooted in the protection of slavery and white supremacy. Not at all the universal freedom we're so often taught. In today's political climate, we're seeing Donald Trump and his movement not only revive virulent racism and xenophobia, but also double down on the myth of American exceptionalism to justify it. Why is this myth so central to maintaining racial and class hierarchies in the U.S., and how does confronting the true history of the nation threaten the foundations of that power? And who better to answer that than my dear friend, comrade, Professor Gerald Horne? Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, you want to tackle that question, which is really doubling down on that myth of American exceptionalism, why it's so central to maintaining racial and class hierarchies in the U.S., to have that kind of divisiveness, that kind of xenophobia, and so on?
Well, first of all, your audience needs to recognize that there is a split in the historiography, that is to say, how the history is being written nowadays. Increasingly, there is a trend represented by my work, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origin of the United States of America, my most recent book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, the work of paramount black intellectual Ishmael Reed, spoofing and sending up the Broadway cum Disney extravaganza Hamilton. I'm thinking of the work of the late Fordham Dean, Tyler Stovall, entitled White Freedom. And if you look at the work that I've just enumerated, you would walk away with the idea that this settler colonial regime, established in 1776, not unlike other settler colonial regimes, was based upon class collaboration between and amongst the European arrivals. That is to say, if you go back to 1580, where you had the first arrivals from the British Isles into what they called North Carolina, it was a classic class collaborationist enterprise. That is to say, the 1% in London sponsoring those of diverse class backgrounds, both bent upon the mutual goal of uprooting the indigenous population, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, being able to drag Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free. And so when 1776 occurs, it is turbocharging that process that was initiated in the 1580s. And it's not just the question of class collaboration between and amongst those of European descent. It was met, oftentimes awkwardly, with class struggle on behalf of the unpaid sector of the working class, that is to say, the enslaved Africans. And even though there is this continuing discourse, oftentimes pitting a false dichotomy of race and versus class, basically, if you look a bit more deeply, as some of the work I've enumerated suggests, a better dichotomy would be class struggle versus class collaboration. And it's not just the indigenous Africans who were involved in seeking to overturn the settler colonial regime. Recall that during the War of 1812, which is centered in my most recent book, as noted, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., recall that when the Redcoats invaded Washington, D.C. in August 1814, it's not only that they were joined by enslaved Africans in helping to torch the city torched the White House, sending President James Madison and his guerrilla spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets, one step ahead of the posse, and then the formerly enslaved Africans escaping on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. It's also the fact that a good deal of the Native American population was in solidarity with the black population. The paramount Native American leader, Tecumseh, died fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Redcoats during the War of 1812. And so it's clear that we not only need a new narrative of the founding of this country, which, as I said, is already in motion, we need a deeper imbibing of this new narrative embodied in the works that I've just enumerated.
So take us a little deeper into some of the details from your book on Washington, D.C. and how does that actually pave the way for, gee whiz, I don't think January 6th was in that unique at all. And certainly the aspirations, commentary, and behavior of Trump, if anything, maybe he read some of those earlier works, or he certainly aspires to what was going on then. So where's the connectivity?
Well, there are so many threads, it's difficult to know where to begin. First of all, as is well known, many of our friends on the left still adhere to the old-time religion that 1776 was a great leap forward for humanity, even though historians have long recognized that by several orders of magnitude, the black population did not adhere to that moth-eaten notion. And we see that not only with regard to the War of 1812, August 1814, aforementioned, but we also see that with regard to the fact that Washington, D.C., despite the fact that it was supposedly embodying a certain progressive republicanism, small r, Washington, D.C., the federal government was dominated by the enslaving class, starting with George Washington. As I point out in my book, he was one of the largest landowners in the world. In fact, I was able to look at his will, which is filed in the Municipal Archives of Washington, D.C., and it's apparent that when Washington led the revolt against London in 1776, in part, in no small measure, he was responding to the fact that in the Royal Proclamation of 1762-1763, London was seeking to curtail the ability of the settlers to continue moving west, fighting the Native Americans, denuding them of their land, with Britain subsidizing this with blood and treasure. And that, along with Britain's halting moves towards abolition of slavery, embodied in Somerset's case of 1772, it was land and labor that was at the heart of this counter-revolutionary process, which any materialist should recognize instinctively. And so therefore, when the new regime is set up in Washington, D.C., not coincidentally bordering two slave states, speaking of Maryland and Virginia, it was, as noted, dominated by enslavers, not only the White House, particularly enslavers from Virginia, like Mr. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, et al., but also the High Court. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, of course, was a slave owner. The Congress was dominated by enslavers from the Speaker on down. And so one really has to scratch one's head and try to understand how there are those who consider themselves progressive have suggested that this enslaving regime bent upon extermination of the indigenous population somehow was embodying a great leap forward for humanity. Now, certainly, it's possible to say that it was a great leap forward for settlers. For example, in the previous book, I talked about the Cherokees, the indigenous population occupying the southeast quadrant of North America, who sought to assimilate. Many of them converted to Christianity, many of them owned slaves, many of them became sedentary agriculturalists. They developed an alphabet to formulate newspapers that were bilingual in English as well. But with the advent of Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, Mr. Trump's favorite president recalled that he sported Mr. Jackson's portrait on the wall of his office for the longest time, there was the so-called Indian Removal Act. The Cherokees, despite their assimilation, had to go. They were ousted and forced to march into what was called Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, where they were supposed to live profitably. And of course, European settlers just off the boat were able to move into their mansions. So I can understand why many Europeans, those subsequently defined as white, have seen this whole process as being fantastic. But I think it's a rather narrow-minded point of view. And all of us, of course, are maybe, perhaps, possibly about to suffer as we stare down the barrel of fascism as we speak.
You describe the enslaved as engaging in unrelenting class struggle, including joining British forces in 1814 to burn the White House. How does this moment challenge the idea that the American Revolution was the only or most important revolution on this soil?
Well, as I say in the book at hand, The Capital of Slavery, and as I pointed out incessantly and repeatedly in previous works, in order to understand a great leap forward for humanity with regard to the late 18th century and early 19th century, you really have to study the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a revolt, a successful revolt of the enslaved that has ripple effects not only in the Caribbean, but also coursing into the North American mainland. In fact, as I've argued incessantly and repeatedly, the Haitian Revolution ignites a general crisis of the entire slave system that can only be resolved with its collapse, which it begins to do in North America by 1865. That is to say, with the Haitian Revolution, London realized that the jig was up with regard to its own enslaving mania. And so therefore, by 1807, it had moved to curtail London's role in the African slave trade. By the 1830s, moving to abolish slavery itself. We see in my book on Texas, published a few years ago, that after Texas seceded from Mexico in 1836, not least because of this mania for grabbing land and enslaving Africans, Texas had to crawl into the Union by 1845 because it could not withstand the pressure from the Haitian revolutionaries and British abolitionists, not to mention the enslaved population of the Lone Star State as well. And what's interesting about Washington, D.C., is not only its preeminent role in terms of slave resistance, but also the fact that after the War of 1812, the free Negro population of Baltimore being one of the most important cities of the antebellum era, that free Negro population was scapegoated. They were blamed for what happened in Washington, which is a bridge too far. But in any case, that leads directly to the leaders in Washington, including the Chief Justice, moving to colonize, to use the euphemism of an earlier day, that is to say, to deport the free Negro population of Maryland to Liberia, which, of course, is started approximately 2 centuries ago. And then, after the Nat Turner slave revolt of August 1831 in neighboring Virginia, the idea took flight that a good deal of the enslaved population should be freed and then deported en masse to Liberia. And what's interesting is that it was not only the elite of Washington who were pushing the scheme. In neighboring Maryland, that particular state had its own foreign policy. They started an independent Maryland-sponsored colony in West Africa called Cape Palmas, which was eventually folded into Liberia. But alas, all of these efforts to somehow wriggle out of the contradictions of slavery proved unavailing, because we all know that by October 1859, the great John Brown, the leading abolitionist with regard to those descendants of settlers, led an armed revolt in neighboring Virginia, which is now West Virginia, speaking of Harper's Ferry, and it could have succeeded possibly in leading to an armed overthrow of slavery before the U.S. Civil War starting in 1861. But alas, he and his comrades, or at least a goodly number of them, were captured. Some were able to escape to fight another day, including Osborne Anderson, a black person who then writes quite accurately and adequately about Harper's Ferry, which is one of the reasons we know so much about what happened that fateful day in October 1859. Of course, John Brown was hung until the last breath escaped from his body.
You know, one of the things that I was thinking is as I was reading your latest work, Washington saw manumission in 1862 before the Emancipation Proclamation, and enslavers there were compensated for their losses. How does this complicate the narrative of emancipation and really raise questions about who should receive reparations and who didn't?
Well, obviously, the president has been set with regard to reparations. The only question is which class will be subject to repair. That is to say, the descendants of the enslaving class. And of course, one of the latest loony ideas of some on the right is that, yes, there should be reparations to those enslavers and their families and their descendants who had their property taken post-1865 or post-1864, more precisely, without compensation. And of course, as we know, there's a mass movement amongst Black Americans and our allies to forge reparations. In fact, there will be a very important meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in September 2025 of the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc., with the African Union, with reparations being high on the agenda. As we speak, there's a delegation from CARICOM in Brussels at the headquarters of the European Union and in London, once again, putting forward the idea of reparations. And I think that it's a breath of fresh air that all of these new initiatives are being ventilated. And speaking of new initiatives, I would be remiss if I did not mention Juneteenth, a holiday which we just marked days ago, because the traditional story there also is in need of repair in terms of this idea that somehow the enslaved in Galveston, Texas did not know that they were free per the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, when in fact, as I pointed out in my book on Texas, what was in motion was that the enslavers in Texas, the Confederate state least damaged by the U.S. Civil War, had the idea of continuing slavery post-Appomattox, post the surrender of the Confederate States of America, and barring that, moving en masse with their enslaved property into Mexico. Recall, per the Mexican-American holiday Cinco de Mayo, that France had occupied Mexico circa 1862, and it sought to overthrow the abolitionist decree of the president of Mexico of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, who had moved to abolish slavery decades earlier. And so they had this idea of moving with their most valuable property en masse into Mexico. But alas, that idea was thwarted, that diabolical scheme was thwarted by a joint alliance of Mexican patriots and black men in blue in the U.S. Army. A revival of that kind of black-brown alliance needs to be high on the agenda, and that put paid to this scheme of continuing slavery. Although I should mention, in all fairness, that some of the enslavers did move south of the border with their enslaved property, particularly to Brazil, which does not abolish slavery until 1888, which raises the tantalizing possibility that there are Black Americans to this very day who have relatives in Brazil who they may not be aware of.
I really want to thank you for featuring insights into your explosive book, The Capital of Slavery. And in the minute or two that we have left, why? Why is it so important to center the resistance of the enslaved and their allies in our understanding of U.S. history, and what's at stake if we don't?
Well, what's at stake if we don't is that I think we'll creep closer into the barrel of a gun that is looming fascism. That is to say, if you look at the pivotal, crucial events that led to the advance of progress, be it the abolition of slavery in the 1860s, be it the retreat of Jim Crow in the 1950s, it all resulted from a lengthening of the battlefield. That it all resulted from internationalism, the aforementioned Haitian Revolution, the alliance with British abolitionists in the 19th century, the alliance with the socialist camp and national liberation movements in the 20th century, which leads to the agonizing and reluctant retreat of Jim Crow. And I dare say that if we are to beat back the fascist attack, if we are to force Trumpism into retreat, we're going to have to lengthen the battlefield. I'm heartened to note that the leader of the NAACP has spoken quite passionately about the rise of fascism in the United States of America. Good for him. And of course, he has not invited Donald J. Trump to the NAACP convention kicking off in Charlotte within days. But I think he needs to go a step further and recognize the roots of fascism, recognize the fact that in order to beat back fascism, there needs to be a kind of heightened internationalism, an internationalism that I'm afraid to say the NAACP retreated from some decades ago when their leadership made the fateful decision to toss overboard the left-wing leaders in the black community led by the late, great Paul Robeson in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions that have now possibly reached their expiration date.
And in 1 minute, I would be remiss if we didn't say something about what? Gaza? Where does Gaza and where does stopping genocide in our name fit in to this marvelous book, The Capital of Slavery, and all the work that you do, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, to repeat, we have to be internationalists, not only because it's the right, correct, and moral thing to do, but it's also the sensible thing to do. That is to say, the U.S. Treasury, despite the printing of dollars, has a finite amount of money. There can either be our tax dollars going into bunker-busting bombs dropped in Iran or fueling Israeli genocide in Gaza, or our tax dollars can go towards universal child care, an enhanced healthcare system, and, of course, a more sustainable system of higher education and K through 12 education. So that is the stark choice that's looming before us.
You must pick up a copy of The Capital of Slavery. I love the name. I love the play on words and all of the many books that Dr. Horne has done. And I'll be darned if I understand why you haven't gotten on the banned list. I'm not trying to encourage that. I guess they just haven't intellectually even caught up to that level of writing. Well, Dr. Gerald Horne, thanks for educating, agitating, and organizing us to beat back the fascist attack. We've been speaking to Dr. Gerald Horne. His voice is always a clarion call at this moment of backlash and erasure. Thanks, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I'm Mimi Rosenberg. And I'm saying organize, organize, organize.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.